The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering windows of Atlanta Municipal Court's Room 204, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Hawthorne sat behind his imposing mahogany bench, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he surveyed the day's final case. After 20 years on the bench, traffic violations had become mundane, almost mechanical for him. The clerk called out, "Case number 2847, Dr. Maya Richardson, charged with excessive speeding on Interstate 85." The woman who approached the podium carried herself with quiet dignity. Her charcoal gray suit was immaculate, her natural hair styled professionally, and her expression composed despite the clear exhaustion in her eyes. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and articulate, "I understand the gravity of speeding, but I was rushing to reach Grady Memorial Hospital. One of my pro bono clients, a domestic violence survivor, had been admitted after a severe incident." Judge Hawthorne barely glanced at the documents before him. He'd heard every excuse imaginable over the years. "Ms. Richardson," he interrupted, emphasizing the Ms. despite the clear doctor in her case file, "the posted speed limit isn't a suggestion. You were recorded doing 87 in a 65 zone." "Dr. Richardson," she corrected firmly but respectfully. "And yes, Your Honor, I acknowledge that. However, given the circumstances," the judge's gavel cut through her explanation, "the law doesn't make exceptions for personal emergencies, doctor or not. The fine will be $875, plus court costs." Next case. As Dr. Richardson stood there, something flickered across her face. Not anger or defiance, but a look of profound understanding, as if she'd just witnessed a confirmation of something she'd long suspected. She paid the fine without protest, but the slight shake of her head spoke volumes. The young black bailiff watched her leave, his expression troubled. He'd recognized her immediately, but had maintained his professional composure. As she walked past him, he nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture of silent respect that went unnoticed by the judge. What Judge Hawthorne didn't know, couldn't have known as he mindlessly shuffled his papers, was that Dr. Maya Richardson had spent the last 15 years fighting landmark civil rights cases across the country. Her work had dismantled discriminatory housing policies in Chicago, reformed police practices in Detroit, and most recently, she'd been shortlisted for the NAACP's highest honor for her dedication to equal justice. The irony of her standing before him, receiving the same dismissive treatment she'd spent her career fighting against, would soon become painfully clear to Judge Hawthorne. But for now, as the sun continued its descent behind Atlanta's skyline, he simply called for the next case, unaware that this brief interaction would soon force him to confront everything he thought he knew about justice, fairness, and his own role in perpetuating systemic inequities. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta buzzed with the quiet energy of Atlanta's most influential legal minds. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in crisp white linens, where judges, attorneys, and civil rights leaders gathered for the annual Legal Excellence Awards dinner. Judge William Hawthorne sat at his assigned table, occasionally nodding to familiar faces while absently stirring his soup. These events were part of the job, necessary but often tedious affairs filled with small talk and polite applause. He glanced at the evening's program, scanning the list of speakers and honorees. His spoon clattered against the china bowl as his eyes froze on a familiar name. Dr. Maya Richardson, keynote speaker. Below her name was a biography that made his throat go dry. Distinguished civil rights attorney, Harvard Law, argued 5 successful cases before the Supreme Court, instrumental in reforming discriminatory practices across multiple state jurisdictions. A memory of that afternoon flashed through his mind. Her composed demeanor, his dismissive tone, the way he'd emphasized Ms. instead of Doctor, the soup in his stomach turned to lead. The room's attention shifted as the organization's president approached the podium. "Our keynote speaker tonight needs little introduction," she began, "but I'll give her one anyway." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Dr. Maya Richardson has dedicated her life to fighting for equal justice under law. Her recent victory in the Henderson case fundamentally changed how courts approach racial bias in jury selection. Her work has earned her the nickname, the conscience of the courts. Judge Hawthorne felt the blood drain from his face as Dr. Richardson took the stage. She wore the same gray suit from earlier, but now adorned with a beautiful African print scarf. The exhaustion he'd noticed before had been replaced with quiet power. As she began speaking about implicit bias in the justice system, her eyes swept the room, briefly meeting his. There was no anger there, no accusation, something far more devastating. Understanding. She spoke about how prejudice often masquerades as procedure, how bias wears the face of business as usual. Just today, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, I was reminded how easily authority can dismiss humanity when it comes wrapped in certain skin. She didn't look at him, didn't need to. But I don't believe in villains. I believe in systems that need changing and people who need awakening. Around him, heads nodded in agreement. Some took notes. Judge Hawthorne sat perfectly still, feeling as if every word was a brick being added to a wall of self-realization he couldn't ignore. The weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him like a physical force. When the applause came, it was thunderous. Judge Hawthorne's hands moved mechanically, clapping along while his mind raced through years of decisions, wondering how many other Dr. Richardsons he'd faced without knowing, without seeing. The words from Dr. Richardson's speech echoed in Judge Hawthorne's mind for days afterward, keeping him awake long into the night. One evening, he found himself sitting in his dimly lit chambers, reviewing footage from his courtroom's security cameras. The scenes playing out on his computer screen made his stomach churn. He watched himself, case after case, his demeanor subtly shifting based on who stood before him. A white teenager's reckless driving charge met with fatherly concern, while a black woman's similar offense received stern lectures. A Latino man's parking violations drew skeptical questioning, while a white businessman's excuses were accepted with understanding nods. The evidence was undeniable, playing out in high definition. Judge Hawthorne's hand trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, now cold and forgotten. He hadn't seen it before because he hadn't wanted to see it. Each video clip felt like a personal indictment. His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom, startling him. Judge, your daughter's on line 1. She says it's important. Sarah, his youngest, was finishing her sociology degree at Emory. Her voice came through clear and excited. Dad, you'll never believe who guest lectured in my civil rights and social justice class today. His throat tightened. He already knew. Dr. Maya Richardson. She was amazing, Dad. She talked about this case where she represented a group of minority-owned businesses that were being systematically denied loans. The way she broke down how bias works in institutions, it really makes you think about. Sarah's words faded into background noise as a memory surfaced. His own father, also a judge, dismissing a discrimination case 20 years ago. The law is colorblind, he'd always said. Now Judge Hawthorne wondered if that blindness had been selective all along. He opened his court calendar for the next day. 23 cases. How many would he have judged unfairly if Dr. Richardson hadn't inadvertently held up this mirror to his practice? The thought made him physically ill. His daughter was still talking, and she's starting this new training program for legal professionals. Something about recognizing unconscious bias in decision-making. Dad, are you listening? Sarah, he interrupted, his voice hoarse. Could you send me the information about that training program? There was a pause on the line. In 15 years on the bench, he'd never asked for additional training. Really? Sarah's surprise was evident. Dad, that's great. I'll email it right now. After hanging up, Judge Hawthorne sat in his darkened office, staring at the frozen image on his screen. Tomorrow's cases waited. Tomorrow's decisions loomed, but for the first time in his career, he felt truly unqualified to make them. And somehow, That felt like the first step toward becoming qualified again. Judge Hawthorne sat alone in his study at home, surrounded by stacks of case files from the past year. The antique desk lamp cast a warm glow over photographs and documents spread before him, evidence of what he now recognized as a disturbing pattern in his courtroom conduct. His wife Susan appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "See, Will, it's past midnight. You've been at this for days now." She brought him a fresh cup of coffee, pausing to look at the scattered papers. "I haven't seen you this troubled since that death penalty case in '08. "I've been wrong, Susan," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "For years, I've been wrong." He picked up a statistical analysis he'd compiled. The numbers were damning. Defendants of color received fines averaging 35% higher than white defendants for identical offenses. Payment plans were granted 42% more often to white defendants. Even his language, transcribed from court recordings, showed marked differences in tone and patience. "Remember Jimmy from my softball team?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "Last month, I let him off with a warning for going 15 over the limit. Said I understood. He was late picking up his kid from school." He pushed forward another file. "Same week, I fined a black mother $500 for the exact same offense, despite her identical explanation." Susan sat on the edge of the desk, something she hadn't done since they were young lawyers in love. "So what are you going to do about it?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. An email notification from the Judicial Review Board. They'd received an anonymous complaint about bias in his courtroom. His heart raced, but surprisingly, not with fear. Instead, he felt an odd sense of relief. "Maybe this is exactly what I needed," he said, straightening in his chair. "A formal review means everything comes to light. No more hiding from uncomfortable truths." He opened his laptop and began typing. "To the Judicial Review Board, I am writing to fully acknowledge the complaint filed against me and to submit additional evidence of my own." His fingers paused over the keyboard. Susan touched his shoulder gently. "Will, this could end your career. Or it could be the thing that finally gives it meaning," he replied, continuing to type. As the night deepened, Judge William Hawthorne documented every instance of bias he'd discovered, every disparity in his rulings, every moment he failed to live up to the ideal of blind justice. It felt like writing a confession, but somehow, with each word, the weight on his shoulders grew lighter. Judge Hawthorne sat alone in his study at home, surrounded by stacks of case files from the past year. The antique desk lamp cast a warm glow over photographs and documents spread before him, evidence of what he now recognized as a disturbing pattern in his courtroom conduct. His wife Susan appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "Will, it's past midnight. You've been at this for days now." She brought him a fresh cup of coffee, pausing to look at the scattered papers. "I haven't seen you this troubled since that death penalty case in '08. "I've been wrong, Susan," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "For years, I've been wrong." He picked up a statistical analysis he compiled. The numbers were damning. Defendants of color received fines averaging 35% higher than white defendants for identical offenses. Payment plans were granted 42% more often to white defendants. Even his language, transcribed from court recordings, showed marked differences in tone and patience. "Remember Jimmy from my softball team?" he asked, rubbing his temples. "Last month, I let him off with a warning for going 15 over the limit. Said I understood. He was late picking up his kid from school." He pushed forward another file. "Same week, I fined a black mother $500 for the exact same offense, despite her identical explanation." Susan sat on the edge of the desk, something she hadn't done since they were young lawyers in love. "So what are you going to do about it?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. An email notification from the Judicial Review Board. They'd received an anonymous complaint about bias in his courtroom. His heart raced, but surprisingly, not with fear. Instead, he felt an odd sense of relief. "Maybe this is exactly what I needed," he said, straightening in his chair. A formal review means everything comes to light. No more hiding from uncomfortable truths. He opened his laptop and began typing. To the Judicial Review Board, I am writing to fully acknowledge the complaint filed against me and to submit additional evidence of my own. His fingers paused over the keyboard. Susan touched his shoulder gently. Will, this could end your career, or it could be the thing that finally gives it meaning, he replied, continuing to type. As the night deepened, Judge William Hawthorne documented every instance of bias he'd discovered, every disparity in his rulings, every moment he failed to live up to the ideal of blind justice. It felt like writing a confession, but somehow, with each word, the weight on his shoulders grew lighter. The early morning sun painted long shadows across the steps of the Atlanta Justice Center as Judge Hawthorne climbed them with purpose. Today marked the beginning of something new. In his briefcase, he carried a detailed proposal for reforming his courtroom procedures, developed after weeks of intensive bias training and countless hours of research. Inside, he found Dr. Maya Richardson waiting in his chambers, her presence arranged through mutual colleagues. The tension in the room was palpable, like static before a storm. She sat poised, her expression neutral but evaluating. As he took his seat behind the desk, Dr. Richardson, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you action. He pulled out his proposal and slid it across the desk. I'm requesting your expertise to help implement these changes. She picked up the document, eyebrows rising slightly as she read. The proposal outlined blind initial case reviews where defendant demographics would be redacted, mandatory bias training for all court staff, and a diverse community oversight board to monitor sentencing patterns. Interesting, she said, turning a page. Particularly this part about standardized fine structures based solely on offense severity and income level. She looked up, meeting his eyes. But why should I believe this isn't just damage control? Judge Hawthorne opened his desk drawer and pulled out his self-reported evidence to the Judicial Review Board. Because I'd already put my career on the line to address this, I reported myself. Dr. Richardson leaned forward, genuine surprise crossing her face. That's unexpected. She picked up the report, scanning its contents. Her expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect. I'm not asking for forgiveness or praise, he continued. I'm asking for help to ensure no one else faces the kind of bias you experienced in my courtroom. Will you help me make these changes real? A long moment passed as Dr. Richardson studied him, her legal training evident in her careful assessment. Finally, she placed both documents on the desk and pulled out her phone, checking her calendar. I have one condition, she said. These changes can't just be about your courtroom. We need to think bigger. For the first time that morning, Judge Hawthorne smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. 6 months had passed since Judge Hawthorne and Dr. Richardson began their collaboration, and Courtroom 204 had transformed beyond recognition. Gone were the old wooden benches, replaced by a modern, circular seating arrangement that eliminated the hierarchical structure. Digital screens displayed clear information about standardized fines and defendants' rights in multiple languages. Today, a group of federal judges sat in the gallery, notebooks open, watching intently. Judge Hawthorne's courtroom had become a pilot program for judicial reform, drawing attention from courts across the country. A young man stood in the center of the room, charged with shoplifting. Instead of looking up at an imposing bench, he faced Judge Hawthorne at eye level. The judge's new protocol began with a simple question. Before we discuss your case, can you tell me what barriers you're facing? The gallery watched as the story unfolded. The man had lost his job, couldn't afford his diabetes medication, and had stolen food and supplies. Rather than immediately imposing a fine he couldn't pay, the court's new social services coordinator stepped forward, tablet in hand, already connecting him with job training programs and medical assistance. In the back of the courtroom, Dr. Richardson nodded approvingly. This was what justice could look like when stripped of assumptions and bias. The visiting judges whispered among themselves, taking notes furiously. During the lunch break, Judge Hawthorne overheard two of his colleagues discussing the morning session. "It's radical," one said, "but the numbers don't lie. Recidivism down 40%. Community trust up. Even the police report better cooperation. The real shocker," another added, "is the cost savings. Turns out rehabilitation is cheaper than punishment." Back in his chambers, Judge Hawthorne found a note from Dr. Richardson. "Time to take this national." He smiled, reaching for his phone. The governor had been calling, interested in implementing these changes across the state. But why think small? Change, like justice, shouldn't have jurisdictional limits. 2 years had passed since that fateful day in courtroom 204, and the marble halls of the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. buzzed with anticipation. Judge William Hawthorne and Dr. Maya Richardson stood side by side, preparing to address an audience of over 1,000 judges from across America. Their brainchild, the Judicial Equity Initiative, had grown from a single courtroom experiment into a nationwide movement. 47 states had adopted their bias-free courtroom model, and early statistics showed remarkable improvements in judicial outcomes across racial and socioeconomic lines. "Remember when you find me for speeding," Dr. Richardson whispered to Judge Hawthorne as they waited to be introduced. He nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. Who would have thought that traffic ticket would change the American justice system? As they took the stage, the applause was deafening. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had personally introduced them, calling their work a revolution in judicial consciousness. Photographs of transformed courtrooms across the country flashed on the screens behind them. Circular layouts, digital information boards, community advisors, and faces of people whose lives had been changed. Judge Hawthorne stepped to the microphone first. 2 years ago, I was part of the problem," he began, his voice carrying clear across the hushed room. "Today, I stand before you as proof that change is possible, not just in systems, but in hearts and minds." Dr. Richardson joined him, their presence together symbolic of the bridge they'd built. "The numbers tell our story," she continued. 70% reduction in racial sentencing disparities, 85% increase in successful rehabilitation programs, 90% approval from communities previously distrustful of courts. A young judge raised her hand during the Q&A. "Weren't you afraid this would damage your reputation?" she asked Judge Hawthorne. He exchanged a glance with Dr. Richardson before responding. "The only reputation worth having," he answered, "is one built on truth and justice. Real justice, not just the kind we write about in legal books, but the kind that changes lives." As the conference concluded, amid handshakes and congratulations, a custodian approached them. "My son," he said, voice thick with emotion, "he went through your new program last year. Today, he's in college. You gave him a second chance." Dr. Richardson squeezed Judge Hawthorne's shoulder. This was their real legacy. Not the awards or recognition, but the lives transformed by a simple truth. Justice, when stripped of bias, could actually heal. Outside, the sun set behind the Supreme Court building, its words "equal justice under law" gleaming in the fading light. For once, they weren't just words carved in stone. They were becoming reality, one courtroom at a time.